Welcome everybody. This is Heather Riggs from the New England Museum Association. I'm here just outside of Boston on this gorgeous early fall day. I hope you guys are enjoying the weather while it lasts. I just want to say thank you for joining us today at our workshop. We have a big group today. I'm super excited about this one. It's a hot topic, Tegan, so thank you for submitting it and running with it. Today's session will be recorded and available on the NEMO website later on this afternoon. If you need to pop out a little bit early, I will be emailing that link to everybody along with any resources that the speakers will be sharing. So I'm going to stop talking and turn it over to Tegan. She is one of our PAG chairs, and I would like to thank her for all of her work on getting this together and introducing the sessions beyond the bookshelf.
Great. Good morning, everyone. My name is Tegan Kehoe. I'm at the Russell Museum at Mass General Hospital, and I'm co-chair of the Curators PAG. And this morning, we're going to be talking about research, especially online research. And I've been noticing that online research has changed a lot since I was in school. And for people who have been out of school longer than I have, it's changed even more or have been invented since people were in school. And of course, not everyone's academic background is in the same field they work in. So today is really intended to be help for folks who have been in some level self-taught on online resources and people for whom online resources are totally new. So I'm very much looking forward to today's speakers. I'm going to put a link in the chat to a resource list that our panelists have compiled. And this is a Google Doc because we want to encourage folks to contribute to it as well. So if you have favorite resources that are not on this list, there's a space at the bottom to add them. So I've put that in the chat, and I'll probably put it in the chat later on as well, so you can find it again, or for folks who have joined us late. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my co-chair, Tiffini, to introduce our panelists.
Hi, everybody. My name's Tiffini Bowers. I work at the John Hay Library at Brown University, and I'm going to introduce our panelists today. And so first we have Kate Boylan, who's Director of Archives and Digital Initiatives from the Wallace Library, Wheaton College in Norton, Mass. We also have Kathy Fahey, who's in Research and Instruction Librarian at Salem State University Library, and Leah I messed up your last name, Niederstadt. She's an Associate Professor of Museum Studies, History of Art, Curator of the Permanent Collection from Wheaton College. And first, we're going to hear from Kate about the importance of reference interviews. And then we're going to have Leah guide us through provenance research. And last, Kathy will talk about showing us how to find, save, and annotate. So thank you so much. And now I'm going to turn things over to Kate.
Good morning, everyone. Give me 1 second to share my screen, and then we'll get going. Okay. Did I see my screen? Can someone just unmute and tell me yes, because the video controls one.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. Well, welcome to Beyond the Bookshelf. We're all excited to be here with you today. Just again, so that you know who we are. This is who we are. Tiffini, I didn't realize that you were at the John Hay Library, so sorry about that. I just said Brown Library. But once again, I'm Kate Boylan, the Director of Archives and Digital Initiatives at Wheaton College. That means a lot of things on a lot of different days. My background is in digital scholarship and digital collections. I trained as both a librarian and an archivist, and also did some work in film digitization and audio digitization. So that's why I work in kind of a hybrid role at Wheaton. Today I'm going to give you a little bit of librarian archivist speak, and I'm going to talk about the importance of the reference interview, which is important when you're working with patrons, but also these are important practices to adhere to when you're researching yourself and when you're doing some deep dives into your collections or into other collections. So with that said, A lot of students and patrons with whom I've worked feel as though they need to walk in immediately knowing all the context and all the details about what they want to research, right? You know, they're a little hesitant, they feel a little shy, they feel as though they don't know as much. And I mean, I've felt that way even when I've gone into government archives or historical societies. So this is something that everybody feels. It's kind of silly, but you know, no one knows the information that they need to know as soon as they come into a library or institution like ours, and that's why we're here. So I often encourage patrons, students especially, young students especially, to tell me about their really big picture goals. Like, let's take a real big bird's eye view of what you're wanting to do, and then start to ask more detailed questions to clarify goals and know about their desired outcomes. So I'm going to talk about an example. That is, if my computer decides to work. There we go. The example that I'm going to reference today is about when a student approached me about wanting to find images and objects associated with women's suffrage. They began searching in JSTOR Forum and in ArtStore, which are both subscription databases and aggregators of images to which Wheaton subscribes. But as Kathy is going to talk about in a little while, she's going to let you know how to get in to those databases from the public library side, and from using some different resources to get your hands on those databases and aggregators. So often, just so you know, students come in and say, I need a collection that highlights X. And what students don't often realize is that you really need to dig through collections to highlight X. They're out there, but you need to do some research. So I asked first how they had searched, where they had searched, and if they were even logged into the subscription database. Doing so offers more bells and whistles to our students at Wheaton. And again, many public libraries and many public institutions have offerings to these databases as well. So you're going to make sure that you're going to want to make sure that you register with these databases. Anyway, they had started with a search in ArtStore for Feminiz. If you can see, it's really tiny on the screen. Feminiz with an asterisk, and hat, and march, as they wanted to find images of pink hats from the 2016 Women's March. But we came up with these hats instead, which are not from 2016. And that led them to fall down new and different research rabbit holes. If you have questions about how to search in databases, that's something that Kathy and Leah and I can kind of address at the end to get all sorts of different results. So moving on. Why did this image come up? Why did these old kind of Victorian era images come up, or early suffrage images come up? We happened to click into this image to find out a bit more about it. Why had it been returned in our search at all when we were looking for feminism or feminist and hats and march? Well, we started to look at the item details and to find out who created this image, when it was created, how it was created. Was it, a gelatin silver print? Was it made or created somehow differently? And really, the reason it was returned is because it was all about the metadata. Metadata is something, data about data, and metadata is something that makes the hearts of archivists and some librarians swell with excitement and pride and love, and we just can't wait to get into the nitty-gritty of it. Metadata is, just going back a slide, all of these terms that are to the right of the photograph are metadata. They're applied terms to help people search and find and land on content. So the patron and I had a long talk about finding aids and linked data and IIIF, as well as Creative Commons licenses and copyright and fair use. I'm sure that many people are grappling with both metadata and copyright issues in their collections. Happy to talk about that later too. But those are stories for another day. And again, if you have questions, I'm happy to address them later on. So back to this image. As it turns out, what they really wanted to find was content relative to the linked metadata at the bottom of the item details pictured here. Now, again, this is an image from ArtStore. This is where and how they organize their terms, their search terms. But you can see that the box around the terms at the bottom highlight women and women's studies, American photo archives, feminism, both with a capital and a lowercase f, so on and so forth, women's studies. And that's why this photograph came back in the search for feminists, hats, and march. From here, we walk through searches in other big aggregate houses and collections like the Library of Congress, using the same terms. So using women's studies, using feminism, using suffrage, so on and so forth. We searched for in the DPLA, and again, these are big aggregate houses. They are kind of linked, they are databases, but they're not subscription based, and they're publicly accessible, and they help lead you to smaller collections. Europeana is the sister database of the Digital Public Library of America. We looked in there just to see if there was different suffrage information in Europe or about American suffrage. And then we started going into more academic journals, going back to JSTOR and using the terms that we found in ArtStore and applying them for more specific searching. I don't know why this is doing this. Oh, and also using Academic OneFile. And again, Kathy's going to address on how to kind of get your hands on some of these resources later on. So finally, we landed on talking about where women's suffrage was born in the United States, in Saratoga Springs. So I helped the student think about local collections to Saratoga and the Women's Rights National Historic Park. We had to start big in order to get really focused. And sometimes after lots of contextual research, it's best to go right to the source. Sometimes vice versa, it's best to start really local and then branch out into collection aggregators. But it's nice to know that you have two different options and many different ways of accessing local content. I'm also happy to talk about, in one of the aspects of my role at Wheaton is to make sure that our collections are publicly accessible, our digital collections are publicly accessible. So if you have questions about how to get them onto kind of big aggregate houses, then I'm happy to talk about that as well. Anyway, this is all to sum up. Hopefully this is just one of the ways patrons stumble upon our, meaning the New England Museum Association members, kinds of specialized content and unique collections. You start with big ideas, you find the perfect piece of information or an object to highlight and complete your research, and then you kind of go to town. Sometimes patrons come to us asking questions as though they're shots in the dark, and sometimes they know more than they think they know, and they can go right to the source. Again, there are different ways of approaching research. So I'm now going to hand it over to Leah, who's going to talk a little bit about different rabbit holes that her students have fallen into and the research methods that they've used to get there. And again, happy to answer questions later. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Kate. Someone can just give me a thumbs up to let me know that you can see my screen. Great, thank you, Tiffany. I appreciate that. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking Tegan and Tiffany for inviting me to present today, and also Heather and the crew at NEMA for organizing the event. For those of you who haven't met me or heard me speak before, I'm an anthropologist by training, but at Wheaton, I'm in the Department of Visual Art and History of Art, and I also serve as curator of the college's collection. Sorry about that. I'm gonna make sure that this somewhere, there we go, move forward. And today what I'm going to do is talk with you about some resources for provenance research. At its most basic level, provenance is the history of ownership of an object. And over the past 75 years, the continued trade in cultural property and the advent of national laws and international conventions, including the 1970 UNESCO Convention, means that it's now really considered best practice for collecting institutions to make sure that they understand the provenance of the objects in their collections and that they determine the provenance of objects that they are thinking of acquiring. And failure to do so can have some really significant ethical and legal implications, none of which are positive. Provenance research can help to determine an object's authenticity and its financial and academic value, and it can also facilitate the return of objects that have been looted or stolen. And this has recently received greater public attention in the last decade, particularly starting after 2015 with the wonderful movie in which Helen Mirren starred, Woman in Gold, which discusses the restitution of a portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer by Gustav Klimt that was returned to the heirs of the original owner. While many of us have to conduct provenance research as part of our daily work, few of us have specialized training in this area. You can now earn a master's degree in provenance research at the University of Glasgow, but most of us don't focus on such work exclusively. One exception is Dr. Tori Reed at the MFA, or Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. She is, to the best of my knowledge, the only endowed provenance curator in the United States, if not in the world. While conducting provenance research is not the primary focus of my role at Wheaton, my students and I have been researching the ownership histories of collection objects for the last decade, both as class assignments and through their employment as work study students with the permanent collection. And although the college has never had a museum, we have more than 8,000 objects, and the collection is encyclopedic on a small scale. So it's a really wonderful pedagogical resource, and there are also many, many opportunities for provenance research. Even if you've never done provenance research, trust me, if first-year undergraduate students can do it, then so can you. And although they, much as you might have access to paper files, objects, files, donor files, archival documents, and photographs, much of the research that they do is conducted using online resources. And in fact, in the digital age in which we all now live, digitized resources are increasing all the time, and you can literally access hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of documents and photographs through online databases just using your smartphone or your laptop computer. When I take students to meet Tori Reed at the MFA, someone usually says to her, how do you get started? Like, where do you start? What do you do when you get stuck? And she inevitably answers in the same way. She says, start with what you know and keep track of your research. So let's talk about the second part of her advice first. The ways in which we keep track of our research is highly idiosyncratic. And at Wheaton, we've done everything from use notebooks to Google Docs to Microsoft Word documents to spreadsheets. It's really up to you. If you have an account with one of the genealogical websites with which some of you may be familiar, you can use the family tree feature that many of them have to keep track of the familial relationships between owners of objects. And if you have an Ancestry.com account, you can even upload images and PDFs to your family trees that you create. What's most important is to choose a method and stick with it, and making sure that you take note of where you've looked, what search terms you've used, and what you found. And when you download images or files or upload them to whatever method you're using to keep track of your research, it's really important to label them so that you know what they are and you won't have to struggle to identify them later. Once you've decided how to keep track of your provenance research, you need to start with what you know. And it may be very basic. It could be the name of an artist, a date or location, perhaps even the name of a previous owner or the donor of the object. You may find clues to galleries or auction houses, like this label on the back of Elihu Vedder's painting The Motherless from 1865. You should also keep in mind that titles of works may change. So in his 1910 biography, Vedder referred to this work by its title, The Motherless, which is how we know it at Wheaton. However, when we looked at the Archives of American Art at the Smithsonian Institution and found his financial records, we discovered that when he documented the work when he originally created it, he identified it as a girl feeding chickens. which you can see there in the upper right-hand corner. So through that research using the Internet Archive as well as the Archives of American Art, we were able to learn more about the painting's provenance. Again, you take what you know and you go from there. It's also important to remember that many of your clues may be actually physically on the object itself. It may be signed by an artist or have a title plate screwed into its frame. You may find that the artist's signature has changed over time. They may originally have used their initials and then they might start using their full name. If it's a female artist, after marriage, they might change and use their married name, so you need to keep that in mind. And don't forget to look at the back of the object, because paintings may have an inventory number written on the stretcher, or you may find gallery or exhibition labels glued to the back of a frame. Works on paper may have inventory numbers, collection stamps, or notes written on their verso, while additional numbers or gallery tags may still be affixed to 2D and 3D objects. For example, if you see here the back of this 16th century Flemish engraving, when we removed it from its frame to have it reframed for an exhibition, we discovered that there was a collection stamp in the lower left-hand corner and an entire paragraph of handwritten Latin text. In case anyone asks, I do not speak Latin, so Google Translate comes in very handy. It's also important to remember that photographs can be quite useful clues. The impetus for conducting provenance research at Wheaton came from the Frick collection, when one of the staff emailed to ask about a painting in our collection called Audrey the Shepherd Lass, and they attached a small black and white photograph to the email. It showed the painting hanging in the home of Bertha and Potter Palmer, who were wealthy Chicago industrialists and who had amassed a large collection of artwork in the 19th century. So through this photograph, the Frick was able to confirm that the painting in the Palmer collection was now at Wheaton, and we were able to get a more thorough provenance of the painting. I've already mentioned the Archives of American Art at the Smithsonian Institution, but I'd like to briefly mention two other resources on the list that Tiffini and Tegan have shared with you. The Getty Institute in Los Angeles, California has a large initiative dedicated to provenance research, and its Collecting and Provenance Research website has a wide variety of advice, guidance, and link to resources, including the Getty Provenance Index, which is especially useful if you're researching a well-known artist or what is often referred to as quote-unquote fine art. And you'll notice that you can search using a wide variety of terms, and you can either include or exclude certain databases that you'd like to investigate. Similarly, the Art Loss Register, which is privately operated, maintains a list of stolen objects, including fine art, decorative arts, and antiquities. And if your institution is planning to acquire a major work, it's always worth checking the Art Loss Register to make sure that it hasn't been reported as stolen. In addition to the aforementioned resources, once you've determined where you're going to start, you have a number of comprehensive, often free resources. Genealogical websites in particular can be invaluable to the provenance researcher. Some of them, such as familysearch.org or findagrave.com, are free. And if your institution doesn't have a subscription to ancestry.com or findmypast.com, you can always sign up for a free trial membership to see how useful it actually is. And if you do find it useful, ancestry.com can be accessed if you have an e-card from the Boston Public Library. Local libraries also often provide access to genealogical websites. If you look on these websites, you can find everything from birth and death records, marriage licenses, military records, and census records, which can be useful for identifying the town or city in which the owner or donor of an object may have lived, as well as the familial relationships they had, which can sometimes indicate who might have inherited a work from someone. When using genealogical websites, you may want to start by making your search very narrow, because you might get lucky and find that needle in the haystack right away. So you can search for an exact match of an artist or owner's name and an exact date range. If that doesn't return any results, you can broaden out your search and allow for name variants or a range of birth or death dates or dates of activity. Each website does this differently. Here you can see that Family Search allows you to search for individuals in relation to a spouse, a parent, or another person. It also allows you to check the box next to names and locations or at the very bottom of the search page, and that will narrow your search by just searching for an exact match to the terms that you've entered. Similarly, findmypast.co.uk, which is the UK version of findmypast.com, allows you to set ranges for birth and death dates and for how near or far from a particular geographic location you'd like to look. Here you can see that we're searching for Gladys Ella Williams, born 1890 plus or minus 1 year, and allowing for name variants. I've also checked, which you can't see here, I've restricted the search to Aberdeenshire, Scotland. And if I do that and allow for name variants, I get 24 results, but I restrict it and I just want to find someone named Gladys Ella Williams, born between 1889 and 1891, then I only get 1 result. If, however, I keep the restriction on the name, but I allow for anywhere within the United Kingdom, I'll get 109 results. So you can play around with this as you try to narrow in on identifying the person. Findmypast.co.uk was invaluable when we were attempting to identify the artist who created a set of 61 drawings that the college acquired in 1997. 52 of them had been signed, usually with the initials GE and then Bengoff. A few of them had the first name Gladys, and one of them had a date of 1934, which allowed us to try and narrow down in our identification of the artist. But the dealer from whom we acquired the collection and several years of student research did not turn anything up. Eventually, however, through findmypast.co.uk, we were able to identify a Gladys E. Bengoff, who in 1939 was living in England with her son, which indicated that she had once been married. And then we were able to identify her husband, Neville Stewart Harcourt Bengoff. And that then led us to the marriage certificate, and a comparison of her signature on the marriage certificate and the signature on the drawings indicated that we had found the correct artist. Sometimes what you may know about a collector may only be their married name. This is particularly the case with women collectors in the 19th and early 20th century. So when Wheaton received a large gift of paintings in 1922, we only knew that it was from Mrs. Thomas O. Richardson and that she had a home in Newport, Rhode Island. Later research indicated that the painting had been acquired from the artist Thomas Hughes Hinckley by a Richard Baker, but we didn't know the connection between Richard Baker and Mrs. Thomas O. Richardson. But student research uncovered a New York Times article mentioning that a Mrs. Thomas O. Richardson had rented the Richard Baker estate to one of the Vanderbilts for the summer season. And then they also found a then recently digitized back issue of the New England Journal of Medicine, which mentioned that a Mary Rich Richardson had given $1 million as part of her estate to build a hospital in memory of her parents, Richard Baker and Ella Maria Baker. So we were able to eventually determine that the painting had been inherited from Richard Baker by his daughter, Mary Rich Baker Richardson, who kept it in the family's estate in Newport, Rhode Island, and eventually gave it to the college in 1922. Provenance research is not always straightforward. It's about finding the connections between people and places and objects, but with a little bit of persistence and a bit of luck, students were able to determine the full provenance for this painting, which now hangs in the office of Wheaton's president, Dennis Hanno. And hopefully you too, with some persistence and luck, will have success with your provenance research. Thank you. I'm turning the floor over to Kathy now.
You're muted, Kathy.
That's okay. I'm just talking to myself on how to Google, so don't worry. All right. I should be unmuted and you should all be hearing me. Yes? Maybe? Awesome. Yes. All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Kathy Fahey. I'm a research and instruction librarian at Salem State University, where mostly what I do is I teach undergraduate and graduate students how to research. I also work a lot with community members, people who are not students, to conduct their research. One of the things, we have a strong relationship with the Peabody Essex Museum, which is just 1.5 miles down the road from us, where we do a lot of work with the museum. We visit, classes visit the PEM pretty constantly. And I got to know a number of the staff in the education department. And a few years ago, I developed a course for their research guides, which are their research docents. So museum volunteers who are tasked with finding information about artists, exhibits, upcoming exhibits, history research. And these are people who want to help the museum, but who are not necessarily employees, and they don't have library cards. They don't have access to a lot of the research tools. So this part of the presentation is going to be on ways in which you can access materials, how you can save and organize your research, and how also you can annotate, how you can take notes on web data. So, you know, no library, no problem. So there are so many ways to get access to library materials if you don't have access to a university library, if you don't have access to a research library. One of the things you should start by doing is looking to your state and local libraries. In Massachusetts, the Boston Public Library is open to everyone who lives, works, or goes to school in Massachusetts. You can get an e-card and access their resources online. And in the before times, you were able to walk into the building and conduct research there. Maine, the Maine State Library has a similar thing. If you live, work, or go to school in Maine, you can apply for a Maine State Library card. Also, local cities and towns have agreements. In New Hampshire, the Concord Public Library specifically has clauses for people who work in Concord or in the surrounding counties to get a Concord Public Library card. So you should definitely look into the state and local metropolitan areas in your own area. Another thing is if your university has alumni cards. That can be very useful now that more and more things are online. I did my undergrad in upstate New York and graduate school in Canada, which means going into my local alum libraries was not an option. But now that things are digital, and now that, actually one of the only good things I can think of from COVID is that more things are being made digitally and more things are being made available freely or with less restrictions, is that if you did your undergrad in a faraway place where you can't drive to it, you still might be able to get an alumni card. And this depends on the university. Some universities will charge you a fee for a year. Some give them out for free, but it's something you should look into. Public university libraries, especially in Massachusetts, the public universities, the state universities, the UMasses, and the community colleges, our libraries are public libraries. So especially in the before times, anyone could walk into my library, walk into Salem State, sit down at a computer and use our resources because our resources are funded with public funds. So we are open to everyone. Right now, we're not. Right now, we're only open to students to control numbers, but definitely look to your public areas, your public libraries. And again, this will vary by state. So I'm not sure on what other states' public university systems are like, but look to the states. You've heard Kate and Leah mention JSTOR. That's a fabulous database. It's 100% full text. It's very in-depth, but it costs a lot of money. JSTOR has been opening up open access journals. These are scholarly research journals that are not behind a paywall. You do not have to pay to access them. So JSTOR and other databases, Project Muse, they have wide collections of publicly available materials that you can search within their public scope. And then the DOAJ, the Directory of Open Access Journals. These journals are specifically not behind a paywall. They're not published by Elsevier or Science or some other corporate entity. These are journals that anyone can access for free. You don't have to pay to access. And then digitization has really taken off. These are 2 great repositories. There are so many more in the chat, but the Internet Archive, number 1, this is a repository of every website ever published. So you can look at their Wayback Machine and see the beginnings of the web from like 1993. It also has a strong music, audio, ebook, image collection. And Hathi Trust is a repository of digital books from many universities. So there are so many resources that you can use, and you should definitely look at the document we put in the chat to see more of them. Google is your friend. I'm sure we all go to Google and we type in provenance research on my object, or where to find information about cows. And we all Google all the time, and it is a great place to start, but there is so much more within Google that you can do. You can use Google Advanced Search. And what this does is it lets you use more technical searching options. You can search for all words, exact words of phrase. You can remove words. So you can search for Red Sox, not baseball. You can search for cows, not bulls. You can sort by language. You can look for media published in a particular region. You can limit by date. If you know your domain, if you only want to look for results from education institutions, you can limit it to .edu. You can limit by file type. So if you want to look for PDFs or images, you can limit by file type. So Google Advanced Search is a wonderful tool for focusing in more and getting more specific with your results. There's also Google Scholar. And Google Scholar is a search engine that searches for scholarly articles from these open access databases, from other, from publishers' websites. But this, as opposed to going to regular Google, will give you things that are mostly peer-reviewed and mostly have strong editorial control. It won't be, Joe's cat blog. It will be something from a veterinarian journal, all right? So Google Scholar, again, very great tool. But what I love most about Google Scholar is you can set links to search libraries that you have access to. And there are directions on how to do this in the document in chat. But basically, in Google Scholar, you can set up a profile so that you can have up to 5 libraries that you can access, that you can search Google Scholar and get full text articles from those libraries. So I have Salem State and Boston Public Library because that's where I work and do my research. But when I would search in Google Scholar now, I would get the full text links that say, here, click on this and get full text from Salem State, or get full text from BPL. So if you get this set up for your library in your community, you can get those full text links right away. My other favorite thing with Google Scholar is you can set up search alerts. You've done your research. You've gone through what Kate said and you did your reference interview. You've decided on what search terms to use. Do you want to go back every day and see if there's new things coming up? No, we've got all stuff to do. What you can do is set up a search alert so that whenever new things come up on your search query, you will get an email automatically. You can set the frequency for this. I have a search on Gwendolyn Brooks that I'm helping a faculty member with. So I set up a search alert. So every day that there's new information published on my topic, I get an email that says, hey, look at these new results. So Google will continue to do your research for you. You type in your search, you can set up the search alert, and again, directions on how to do this are in the chat document. And you can have your research constantly running in the background. Say you want to get new hits. You've got a person like the Gladys Ella Williams that Leah was talking about. You want to see anytime a new thing comes up with her name. Maybe a new collection got digitized. Maybe family papers came online. Google will send you an alert anytime new things are added to the internet that meet your search criteria. So that is very cool. All right, you have set up your searches. You have done your search. How do you keep track of your results? There are a number of citation management tools out there. And these are things that just collate your websites, your books, your articles that you're hitting on. I like Zotero because it's free. It's at least freemium. That means there's a free account, and if you need more storage, you can pay for more. But what Zotero is, it exists as a web tool that you would have to create a user ID for. And then you get an extension that you can add to Chrome or Firefox. And anytime you go to a web page, a database, an image, anything on the web, you click the Add to Zotero button, and it saves your image to Zotero, it saves your data, and it creates it in a stored library. And then what you can do is you can group your citations according to topic. You can then, if you need to collaborate, you can share them publicly. And then say you need to, at some point, you want to publish your data or you want to generate a bibliography, it will generate a bibliography for you. My students love this. It doesn't do it perfectly. You still need to spell check it and proofread it according to your citation style, but it's a great help. There are a number of other citation management tools. I like Zotero. Like I said, it's free, it's web-based, it's very easy to use. And then annotations. I don't know about you, but when I'm doing paper research, I love to take my PDFs or my books. I've got a highlighter, I've got a number of colored pens, and I'm always highlighting things and I'm writing marginalia notes and I'm arguing with the text. That's how I research, that's how I engage with the text. And on the screen, you can see on the left, we've got some marginalia from a 1704 printing of Newton's optics. And you can see that they've made notes, they've made margin notes. This is how we've researched with paper for years. How do we do this with online documents or web native documents? There's a great tool called Hypothesis, which again is a free tool. You can sign up for a web account. Again, it is an extension that you would install in Chrome or Firefox. And anytime you find a web document, so this could be something from the DPLA, something from your museum's website, something from ancestry.org, you can highlight the text and then you can add a note, just like you would write in the margins of a book. And these things are saved as an overlay on your website. So you can turn off the highlighting if you want to read the text as clean. But what Hypothesis also does is if you go back, if you're on the initial website where you're highlighting, you can make highlights and notes. If you go back to Hypothesis, you can see all the notes that anyone who has ever used Hypothesis has made. So this could be really interesting crowdsourced material and crowd collaboration. Maybe there's 3 or 4 people who are looking for Gladys Ella Williams. And you could all, you don't know that you're all looking for the same collector or you're all looking for the same provenance. So you can find other scholars who are looking at the same topics as you are. You can see their notes. So you can see if other people are drawing similar conclusions or different conclusions. So these are great, great tools to play with. The thing about Hypothesis, you can just highlight and then you can delete the highlights later. So you're not going to break the internet or destroy anything if you use it. So definitely play around with it. It's such a fun tool. It gives me, reading online is not the same as reading in paper, but Hypothesis lets me, read and take notes on PDFs without having to print, without having to print them out. And like, how do I mark up a web page? That's always been the hardest part about doing web-based research, is how to actually take notes or in-text notes on the web. So these are just a few tools. There are thousands of other free tools out there, and I'm happy to talk more in the question and answer period about specific tools that might help you. So with that, we're at the question and answer period. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and hopefully, thank you for listening to all of us. Hopefully we've given you a good overview of some tools, and we are all happy to take questions from you now. So either in the chat or raise your hand, and I guess Tegan and or Tiffini will moderate the questions. And just doing a quick look in chat. Yes, JSTOR is accessible through Boston Public Library. If you have a BPL e-card, you can absolutely access JSTOR through that. And many colleges and universities access JSTOR. The one thing about JSTOR is what you have at one school may not be what you have at another school, because JSTOR is a collection of many different journal collections. So for example, at Salem State, we have a strong nursing program. So we have a ton of nursing and biology database collections within JSTOR that Boston Public Library may not have. So just be aware that there are slightly different flavors of JSTOR out there. And yes, Google Books is awesome too.
A question to kick off the Q&A period. Do you have recommendations of what to do when you suspect that there are some archaic words that are going to be search terms, but you don't necessarily know all of what they are, especially when you're, some of those archaic terms are slurs or things like that, and they're not in your active vocabulary, finding ways to find what you should be looking for in these older documents?
So I can answer that because that's something that my students have run into. There's a number of courses at Salem State where they're looking for queer literature. And this is a specifically touchy thing because current vocabulary around queerness is not the same as it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 15 years ago, let alone in the 1850s, let alone in the 1700s. So part of this is the students have to look at what is today's terminology and be aware of what the terminology was 50, 100 years ago, depending on how far back they want to go. For example, trans people. Nowadays we can use trans, we can use transgender. In the 70s, we might have used transsexual, and before that, we might have used other words like crossdresser or hermaphrodite. And knowing those words in a historical context and using them specifically in full text search engines like JSTOR to access those historical materials using the language of history when those historical objects were talking about themselves in that time period is just something we have to do. But how do we present it in current terms? We have to acknowledge that the historical words are problematic today, but in history, so say when that object was created, this is what it was searched for. And if you don't know historical words for things, the more you read and the more you engage with the discipline in your topic, the more you will learn the language of the discipline in your topic. So when you read, you look at two different levels. You're reading for information and you're reading for how to search. How does your topic talk about itself? Is the Oxford English Dictionary helpful for this? It absolutely can be. But again, you kind of have to know a search term or a word to get there. But that can absolutely be useful for helping when was language introduced, when was words introduced, and what their derivation is. So if you've got access to the OED, it's really awesome. Yeah.
We have another question in chat.
Yeah.
What's the best way to research images or find the proper ownership and copyright for publication? Would anyone like to take that?
Well, can I ask a clarifying question on that?
Sure.
Are you looking for, I need an image of a girl drinking coffee to go on a brochure? Or are you looking for, I have this historical image, how do I do more of the provenance?
And feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I just unmuted. So I'm on a board of a poetry society, and so it's not museums, but and we're doing a special edition of the Poets Laureate of New Hampshire, and so we've gone back and we're looking, contacting presses and all that. But I've been responsible for the images of the dead poets, and there's so many things have been reproduced so many times, trying to trace the image, and then also trying to figure out, when do I need to contact the estate? So, I have this image of Maxine Kumin, but, do I need to contact her estate since it's an image of her? So I'm just trying to find out those kinds of things. And I find the copyright information is really difficult, and then also tracing the images. And I didn't know if one of these search engines or databases might be a place that could help with kind of tracking that back, an image back. I just want to do my due diligence so that we're not violating any.
Yeah.
So.
Kathy, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can start with that a little bit. Because one of, so my coworker, Alex Peary, is now the new Poet Laureate of New Hampshire. So there's this cool connection there. Yeah. So if you're looking for images, so Google image search, Creative Commons, Wikimedia, those all have public domain images. So you might very well find a public domain image of Maxine Kumin that you can just use. And that might be the easiest thing. The other thing you're going to run into is you've got what we call the mid-20th century digital orphans. So is it a family snapshot of Robert Frost that was taken in 1950? Technically, you have to find the owner of the Kodak camera that took his picture and ask them for publication rights, or their estate. And then tracking that down gets into, when did, Uncle Billy die? Or when did Concord Photography Studios go out of business, and who took over that?
Yeah,
so
I found it much easier when I was publishing my own book, which was an art history book, because you get the image from the museum, and you would go through one of the image rights administrators of copyrights. They weren't that. So and then dealing with the date, if it was 75 years before or whatever, 75 years, then I didn't have to worry about it. But I've just found this much more difficult than that. So anyway, so that's what I was trying to figure out, what could be used for that.
It's a beast. I used to work in a government photo image archives, and we even ran into issues where Getty was saying that they actually owned and copyrighted an image that was a public domain image. And because of, basically the ubiquitous nature of digital images now, a lot of people can kind of claim copyright when that's not true. So I just answered Stacy in the chat, and I know I jumped ahead of a few questions, but I figured we'd get back to the other image-related questions. Sometimes a good old-fashioned phone call really does wonders. for example, just this past winter, I was helping a former faculty member at Wheaton publish their book as an open access resource on our digital repository. The press that they had used folded, and so she really wanted it out there and accessible, and she wanted it free. She, wasn't making gobs of money off of royalties or anything like that. So she said, I'm still affiliated with Wheaton. I'm an emerita faculty member. I want this up and out there. And she had obtained image permissions and license, and obtained license to a few different images and an Ogden Nash poem. And even though the poem is up for public domain in like 2 or 3 years, she still obviously had to obtain permissions to use it, and she had to pay for a license. And they know that it's freely accessible, so on and so forth. But this is all to say, I'm getting into the weeds. This is all to say that even though something may be on Wikimedia or Creative Commons, it's really, really important to look at that metadata down at the bottom of the images. I'm sure you know this, and to do a little bit, to see if you can do a little bit of backtracking and tracing of where the image came from. And, I tell students this all the time. Students are a little bit more protected than, say, us laymen out in the world because of fair use and using things for educational purposes. But I often encourage them that when they're looking to publish or co-publish with a faculty member, that they really need to do their due diligence. But you also can only do so much that you can do. You're doing the best that you can. And if you've contacted estates and things are publicly available on Wikimedia with share alike commons licenses and whatnot, then you're trusting the information that's available, and that's okay. The most that you might be able, that you would be asked to do, aside from getting like a huge copyright fee, would be especially if it's a digital image, would be a takedown notice. Like, don't use this, use something else. Go find an alternative source. And this has happened. I mean, lots of colleges and universities are kind of facing takedown notices for things, but also a person has to be looking for what you've published in very specific ways. And I'm not saying go and obtain all the digital images and don't worry about it. Do your due diligence, but it also, again, the ubiquitous nature of digital images, and as Kathy said, the mid 20th century orphans, it's really difficult. It's really, really difficult. So it sounds like you're doing all the right things.
We had a related question, which was how legitimate is it to use images from Wikimedia Commons for publications or reproduction?
It is totally legitimate. It is totally, totally legitimate. I also worked for a special library where we relied very heavily on Wikimedia Commons images, as well as those Wikimedia Commons images would often lead us to special collections that were within the public domain or that were open for use. So again, doing a little bit of digging and paying attention to the metadata and the headers at the bottom, or the footers at the bottom of the image pages that tell you a little bit about where Wikimedia Commons harvested images from is an important practice. But Creative Commons, Wikimedia Commons, images on Google Scholar. There's another great source of images that are really good just for icon purposes called the Noun Project. They all have Creative Commons licenses associated with them for free use and for sharing. Sometimes you need to give creator attribution and sometimes you don't. You just need to be wary of that.
Thank you. Feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question or post a question in chat.
And I see that, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I have, my name's Christine Downing. I am retired, but working on projects, as we all do, I think, when we have a chance to do our own work. I saved a couple of collections in media arts in the pioneering period, and this from the 70s and 80s. And there are 2 people who died. And I was in a position to ask where the papers were going, and the family just handed me the keys and said we were going to throw them out. We didn't know what to do with them. And the second one was a family that just they didn't know either. So I have these 2 very amazing collections, and I am putting together, I know something of what's in them. I was involved with them at the same period. But I'm putting together a steering committee and to figure out next steps with this. I have a number of ideas of what might be done, but I'm very interested in seeing these things digitized and made accessible so that somebody in York, for example, can search the database so that there's consistent nomenclature, et cetera. It seems to me that, I mean, there are rights issues. I now have rights to one of the collections, and am waiting for the documents for rights to the other collection. But in the collection I now have rights to, there's I just found an old format videotape that's an interview with Betty Shabazz, who's Malcolm X's widow, who has rights. Do I have to get, I mean, it would seem like if I need to get rights from Betty Shabazz's estate, do I need to do that? Is that right? Yep, okay. Then I think that in my steering committee, I need to have somebody who's really, who's up to speed on all of this. And it sounds like someone like you, Kathy, probably would be very helpful. So I'll call you.
Especially if you're in Rockport,
Yeah.
You're totally in my geographic area. Don't call me because my office phone doesn't work because I'm not in my office, but email me.
I'll do that. Thanks very much.
Yeah.
It's very good.
Yeah. So just a couple of things that came up in chat. Someone asked about, Jennifer asked about Hypothesis for ebooks. Hypothesis is a web-based tool. So if your ebook is on the web, like Project Gutenberg or something like that, then you can use it to annotate. But if you're using an ebook reader, like Kindle or iBooks or Nook, the program that you're using to read the ebook does have a highlight and note feature, but it is trapped within that ebook because of digital rights management and everyone being really cranky about letting the ebook get taken out of that. And Julia made a really great point about Indigenous content and being really careful about that. So I'm going to drop in chat a great book that I discovered last year. It's called Elements of Indigenous Style, a guide for writing by and about Indigenous peoples. It's basically like a citation guide like MLA or Chicago, but for engaging with Native and Indigenous objects and collections. And it has more of a Canadian focus, but because there's nothing like that in the United States, let's use what Canada is doing. So there's the link to that, and I'll drop in the title and author if you're working more with Indigenous and Native cultural objects.
Julia, do you have any other resources that you might be able to share? I believe you were at the Abbey Museum, correct? You might have more resources in that sphere to discuss.
Yeah, I was at the Abbey, and I'll think what, I mean, most of what I know is the tools that are out there for Indigenous communities to control cultural knowledge, recognizing that and this maybe, I know Indigenous community, this is who I've worked with, but
yeah,
a lot of the knowledge and content is actually communally owned, if you would use that term, and so copyright is not the best tool for that. And there are some growing number of tools and databases designed to be able to manage that. But I'll think a little bit more and add stuff to the Google Doc if I can come up with some good resources for that. Absolutely.
Thanks, Julia.
Sure.
There's another question in chat from Nancy. Generally, do public universities offer advice on copyright issues?
So as the public university librarian, I think I have to take that one. And the short answer is no for legal reasons. I am not a lawyer. I do not play one on TV. Therefore, I cannot give you legal advice, which copyright is legal advice. So I cannot tell you that, oh, that's fine. And then you get sued and you sue me, and then the state of Massachusetts gets involved and it gets very, very cranky. So we don't do that. What we do is we point you to educational resources. It is up to every individual. This is what I tell my faculty and students. It is up to you to make the best decision that you can about whether or not you're using it in fair use or in an appropriate way. But we can certainly give you information on how to make those decisions. And if it is big enough that you're asking capital L legal questions, then you do need to contact a lawyer. And yeah, but I'll pop a few links in about copyright, both here and in the Google Doc. The Copyright Clearance Center, I think it's Stanford has a really good, I'll just have to go through some links and I'll pop them in. But the short answer is no, I will not tell you that that is in or out of copyright. But I can have a conversation with you so that you can make a more informed decision about whether it's copyright or not.
Stanford does have a great resource. We often point our
Yeah.
students there and our faculty there. And just seconding, I mean, I don't work at a public institution, but seconding what Kathy's saying, any librarian will say, if you're facing if you're really seeking the legality of copyright, then you need to seek out an intellectual property or copyright lawyer. And IP and copyright are like messy. These people make a lot of money for very good reasons because it's really, really complicated and really, really layered. I will say that many colleges and universities, both public and private, do have public resources on educating yourself about copyright. So we, just for example, at Wheaton, you may need to log in to access some of our research guides, but you can at least get to some content about resources that we've put together for this very purpose. And many, because of the world being upside down, many colleges and universities are posting their video tutorials online too, which I find to be really helpful, just to kind of have different facets of copyright or whatever research that I'm doing kind of be reinforced both visually and audibly, if that makes sense. So I would definitely check out the research guides and resource guides of both public and private institutions. Libraries really like to share information, even if they're under lockdown of being a private institution.
I had a question in the chat from Linda, which Leah responded to in the chat, but I think it's one that almost everyone has had at some point, so it's worth discussing more, which is, how do you know when you've hit a wall and when an object just can't be researched more? So Leah, do you want to elaborate on what you said, or do other panelists want to respond to that as well? Because I think that one's valuable for everyone.
Sure. That collection of drawings by Gladys Ella Williams Bengoff, we tried for years to figure out who she was, and we weren't able to do so, and then just went back to it again, and it was somewhat fortuitous, the right combination of search terms, following up, and we were able to find her. We found her granddaughters through Facebook, actually, so I sent one of those crazy "I'm a Nigerian prince" Facebook messages to the granddaughter, who was kind enough to write back and say, yes, that is my grandmother. And then that led to a whole larger conversation with the family. But we've had instances where auction houses and galleries have refused information, and then 3 or 4 years later I've gone back and all of a sudden they've been forthcoming. So as I mentioned in the chat, if it's an important object or an important person or story, it's worth continuing to work at it. But even Tori Reed at the MFA, who is arguably one of the world's best provenance researchers, she sometimes hits walls that she can't sort of get around. But in the instance of that painting the pasture with cows, the students, the New England College of Journal those had only recently been digitized. So because they were digitized, they were able to find that combination of names together. And where I think we're going to find more and more of that as collections continue to be digitized.
And to that end, Leah, I mean, I just want to add that Leah and I work very closely together at Wheaton, mainly because even though we have separate and maintain separate collections, there's so much crossover of information, but there's been plenty of content that I'll ask her, do you have any information about X, Y, and Z? And she'll ask me, do you have any information about, there's a statue on campus that's a statue of the goddess Hebe holding the, is it the cup of knowledge? Joel Relihan, who's the classics professor, always corrects me on what she's holding, so I want to get that right. Anyway, she, you know, we don't know a lot about her, and Leah and I both need to go through lots of different series and elements of the collection to really get a holistic idea of where she came from and who she was donated by. And I'm probably saying information that Leah knows, but the fact of the matter is that we have not digitized all of our content, and we have not cataloged all of our content. But as to Leah's point, as many archives, cultural heritage institutions, you know, small organizations are working to both digitize their content to both make it accessible, but also to better preserve it, we're going to find out more and more will be uncovered. And like, I'm thinking about the lamp holders in the library, Leah, and that's another really good example of like highly sensitive content cataloged with terminology and metadata that is no longer used. I mean, that telling that story could actually address a whole lot of what we discussed.
Yeah, we have one of the things that I think students often find interesting or surprising is that for so many of the women who gave objects to Wheaton in the 19th and early 20th centuries, we literally do not know what their birth names are, because they are only identified by their husband's names. And so a lot of this work is uncovering these histories. And the largest single donor to Wheaton's collection was, quote unquote, just a wife, and repeatedly called just a wife by every expert I talked to when I was researching her, because she wasn't considered to be an important or knowledgeable collector because she wasn't formally educated. So there's a lot of, there's a social justice angle that comes into this work, particularly around gender and race and ethnicity and socioeconomic status as well. So much of the ethnographic material in our collection, we don't even know what country or culture it comes from, because it's just identified as African or Asian. So there's a lot of work to be done there as well.
And just to piggyback on that as well, we have a digital finding aid tool. We use Archive Space to make our archives collections kind of searchable, at least to the public. And to that end, because of Leah's work, we've started going through, and every single female had Mrs. associated with her name, whether or not she was married. So we've started removing, we've started mitigating that information, and hopefully are going to honor what was actually factual. But as Leah said, it has lots of social justice and lots of layers. It's like a big old onion.
Any other questions, comments, suggestions, challenges?
Complaints, lunch recommendations.
I have another one that I'd like to kind of highlight from the chat from much earlier, and I've lost track of who asked it. And it was sort of a comment, but I want to spin it into a question, which is that it can be hard to keep track of all of the different resources that are out there. So do any of you have recommendations for, other than just, I mean, maybe the recommendation is just keep a list handy, but like, how do you keep track, and how do you decide which resources are appropriate for what you're working on?
I'll take a stab at starting the conversation. You're right, and that there's so much. Sometimes keeping track of this information is like drinking from a fire hose. Like you just can't keep up with it. That being said, as much as I am wary of all the things Google, I've been really impressed with Google Chrome and the Google suite of tools in terms of being integrated with one another, but also the ease with which they make information trackable and organizable. So I am a Chrome user. I rely pretty heavily on bookmarks. I take a lot of notes on the bookmarks. Again, I add a lot of metadata to all the things. This is not surprising. But I try to leverage those tools. And I really, really like the fact that Google, even though it's huge and a little bit Big Brother-like, they're pretty good about allowing you to export to different systems and different platforms. So if one day you wake up and say, I don't want to use the Google Suite and I don't want to use Chrome, they're pretty good about allowing you to export all of the things that you've organized in your bookmarks or other things to, say, Firefox or something along those lines. But also it depends on your institution, where Wheaton is a very heavy Google user. So I'm just leveraging the tools that are freely available to me.
Yeah, and I would definitely say pick a system, even if it starts out as a sticky note on your monitor, where you've been, what you've searched, if it's useful or not. Just for example, at Salem State, we have over 300 different scholarly databases, and that can be really overwhelming. But you will find certain resources that are much more specific to your area, to your institution's area. So if you're an art museum, you're definitely going to be looking more at art and art history. If you are local history or agriculture, then you might be looking more at sciences and less about paintings. But make a list, and then maybe you do a check mark, or maybe you run a spreadsheet where you're like, yep, search that, yep, search that. And this is where, if you set up those Google alerts, or if you can get access to a database like JSTOR or something from EBSCO or ProQuest, you can set up search alerts in there, and they will email you every time a new hit comes up with your search. So this is great. This goes back to that question of what happens if you hit a wall? Well, maybe not everything has been digitized yet. And next year, when something's digitized that meets your requirements, you can get an email notification that says, hey, look, new content. So that's definitely something that I would also suggest, is find a local librarian. And if your local librarian happens to be me, I'm going to volunteer Kate as someone who can answer some questions. We can help you narrow down which of these 300, 500 resources can be more useful and more targeted to you. So definitely find a librarian that we can start that initial conversation. Yeah.
We had another question from the chat. What level of provenance plausibility do you need to make attributions, particularly in cases where the creator is not someone who's been the subject of any scholarly research?
Yeah, I was just typing an answer to that. So
thank you.
In the example I gave, the signature on a legal document perfectly matched the signature on multiple drawings that we had, so we were fairly certain that we had found the right person. I think if it's an object that has significant financial or academic value, it can be trickier, and the level of proof that you need can be more significant. But when I first took students to meet with Tori at the MFA, she gave the example of a Nazi era object that had a problematic provenance. And it had been described as having been looted, but there was no photographic evidence. But the description perfectly matched the object that the museum had, so they repatriated it. Photographic evidence is really useful, and we've had photography now for almost 200 years. But if it's a very important object, either academically or financially, you often need to bring in an expert. And there are experts on most major artists in the world. For someone who's lesser well-known, it may be tougher. But then if you keep digging, you can often figure out some of it. Even have it, I'm an anthropologist, and so I work a lot with material culture that is not often attributed to specific artists. And even in the medieval period, you might have like the workshop of so-and-so. And so even if you can't attribute it to an individual, you may be able to attribute it to a workshop, for example.
Right, I'd like to jump in and add something that I say when I'm wearing one of my other hats, which is training museum docents, which is, it is okay to say that you don't know. And it's okay to say, I don't know, but I think it's this. And I think that when we're speaking with our institution's voices, it can be scary to say, I don't know, but suspected provenance is this, can be your friend, especially if it's not something where it's suspected to be a sensitive issue. If it's something where there's suspected looting, then you're getting into kind of different territory.
And just to be clear, that has come up in the research my students have uncovered. They've uncovered evidence of potential looting. They've uncovered evidence of potential tax fraud. I mean, the number of legal and ethical issues that arise when you have a collection that's now nearly 200 years old, you come up with a little bit of everything. But those are really good teaching moments. And for those of you who are at academic institutions or who have student interns volunteering with your organization or interning with your organization, doing provenance research can be a really great opportunity for them to gain some skills that will be very valuable to them when they go into the real world and find jobs. And they also tend to really enjoy it because it's a detective story or putting together a puzzle. I've only had one student really out of nearly 100 who've done this project that said that they really didn't like it and would have preferred to take a test. But most of them, fewer than 5, have said that out of 100.
Okay, really quickly, public domain. I dropped a link to the Cornell Copyright Office and their public domain page. So depending on how far back the object was, it would be in public domain if it was a work published or created before, I think, 1923. And it's life plus 70 years. So this is where you can do some quick math. But generally it's 1923 for works made in the United States. So if you're a photograph, so public domain is not the same thing as fair use. Fair use is when you're using a copyrighted work in an appropriate manner, such as educational or transformational. Public domain means that the copyright has expired or that it was created by the US government.
Also, just a note, Public Domain Day is in January every year, and it's shortly after the start of the new year, and so lots and lots of collections kind of make available and make like splashy displays and make a big deal of the fact that a lot of their content is now under the public domain.
Yes, and then you also get the Disney and the Sonny Bono saying, nope, Mickey Mouse is still copyright.
Yeah, exactly.
And the Beatles will never be out of copyright, and yeah.
I think we have one more question to round out the program from Kelly. And I'm not sure, Kelly, did you want to unmute and ask the question, or do you want me to go ahead and read it? I will go ahead and...
Thank you. Yeah, I can... Sorry, it was a little long. Yeah, just wondering here from Long-Ear Museum, and sometimes if we're not sure, you maybe just address this, but if we're not sure if something's in the public domain or not, we're really unclear about the provenance, when the photograph was taken, the life of the photographer. So we're really unsure, and it's in our collection, and could be a copy of a copy, and anyway, we're just not sure about it. So we fill out these pretty thorough and lengthy fair use checklist to make sure we're doing our due diligence. And so we've been doing this for years, and I'm just wondering now that some time has gone on. Should we continue to do this? Are we being just overly thorough and this really isn't necessary? So would love some guidance on that.
I think it's a good practice to still adhere to. I mean, I know that it's like another piece of paper and it may feel like unnecessary paperwork, but I think it's a really good practice, and you're documenting your research essentially. You're noting when things are legit and when things are a little fuzzy. My only other recommendation to you would be to get in touch with image heavy or image collection heavy archives that have both public domain and copyrighted images. So for example, the Kennedy Library is a great resource and a great team of folks who work there who are constantly answering questions rather, about what is in the public domain, what is technically a White House photograph, versus what is a family photograph, versus what is a private photographer's work of the president and his family. And they field these questions all the time. So they're just a really good resource. And I know that the Long Year Museum isn't anywhere near close to Columbia Point, but I know that they can answer these questions remotely as well. And they have some good practices set up there as well.
Well, thank you so much, Kathy, Kate, and Leah, for sharing your wisdom with us today. I think this has been really helpful, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us. And thank you all for attending. And definitely reach out if you have more specific questions. Happy to help.
Indeed.
So I just want to back that up and definitely thank the three of you, also with Tiffini and Tegan, for leading this workshop. It was great. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the session is being recorded. I will be sharing that link to everyone, along with the resource page that Tegan shared earlier. So you actually have that in email format, just in case you have to go look in the email for it so you don't lose it. And definitely start adding more stuff to that document. I think this is going to be a great resource going forward, something that you can actually go back to. Again, Tegan, Tiffini, thank you so much. Thank you to Kate, Kathy, and Leah. Kathy, Kate, and Leah, sorry. Long morning already. And I also want to make sure that you guys are aware that we just launched our annual conference for this November. It's going virtual like everything else this year. So make sure to check out the NEMO website for information on that one. We have a bunch of different pricing tiers, also lots of scholarships. So those are pretty easy to apply as well. So if you guys do have any more follow-up questions, go ahead and respond to my email when I send the confirmation out. I will also be sharing everybody's contact information as well if you want to have any follow-up questions. So thanks everybody.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you.